Hey, thanks for tuning in. We're going to do a book review. This is Erwin Lutzer's The Doctrines That Divide, but I'm actually not going to review this book, but a whole book series of different books that actually have no connection whatsoever to each other except for their common topic. So Erwin Lutzer wrote this book, The Doctrines That Divide, a fresh look at the historic doctrines that separate Christians. I want to just show you some of the things he goes through in this book. You can see there the table of contents. Is Christ truly God? Is Christ truly man? Goes through several other different doctrines, and then has a particular focus on predestination and free will, with the historic controversies discussed between Augustine and Pelagius, Luther and Erasmus, Calvin and Arminius, and Whitefield and Wesley. And also closes with a sort of Arminian topic there: can a saved person ever be lost? So this book was good, pretty short book. You can see there, not too many pages. Closes right at 243. Not a lot of references, but just a selective bibliography in the back there. It's The Doctrines That Divide. Now, one thing I found interesting about this book, and one reason probably why the author did not include it, otherwise it would have been much longer, were eschatology. Eschatology was not included in this book. Those doctrines about the end times, discussion of the last things, were not discussed by the author in this book. And I think ultimately the doctrines that he picked are a little bit more crucial, a little bit more fundamental to the Christian faith than eschatology is, but eschatology is very important. And it's interesting that that was not discussed in this book. So I want to talk to you today a little bit about eschatology and where all you can go with eschatology, and we'll start with just a little bit of history. Growing up, I, like most people today, grew up as a dispensational premillennialist, and I'll grab one of these. Commonly teaches dispensationalism. So this is Charles Ryrie, Dispensationalism, Revised and Expanded. All this was the older cover edition for the book, but this is your typical work on dispensational premillennialism. So what is dispensationalism? And all dispensationalists are going to be premillennial in their eschatology. Well, what dispensationalism teaches is that the church and Israel are two distinct entities, and they with two distinct destinies, and God keeps them separate at all points, essentially. And how that functions in the doctrine of the end times is that Christ's kingdom was rejected by the Jews, and now we're sort of in a parenthetical period that makes up the church period, or the church age, or the age of grace, as some dispensationalists would call that. And during this period, God is working with all nations, Gentiles and Jews alike, to call out a people for himself. And he will save them, put them in his body known as the church. Well, one of these days, according to dispensationalism, there's going to occur a secret rapture in which Jesus returns to the earth, but only as far as the clouds. And when he returns to the clouds, he will rapture the church up to the clouds, and then they go up to heaven to be with the Lord, during a 7-year period known as the Great Tribulation, in which God's wrath is poured out upon the earth through the bowls, the vials, and the seals, the trumpets, and the vials there in the book of Revelation. So those are, in the Great Tribulation, you have people being saved. Most dispensationalists would teach. You have a sort of regathering of the nation of Israel. And they teach that this is a time of Jacob's trouble, that this is Daniel's 70th week, and that this time is really to finish things out with the Jewish people. And God's going to seal off 144 Jewish witnesses, as well as 2 witnesses that are distinct from those, and basically to preach the kingdom again. And at the end of the tribulation period, Jesus Christ returns physically and to the earth, and we have the first resurrection, in which all believers are resurrected, and we reign with Christ on the earth in his 1,000-year millennial kingdom. At the end of that 1,000-year millennial kingdom, in which the Jews have a prominent part, you will have the final destruction of Satan as he's thrown into the lake of fire. You have the great white throne judgment, and then you have the eternal state. So that's sort of what dispensationalism teaches in a nutshell. You can see how Israel and the church are kept very distinct in that system. So this is sort of a typical work along those lines. And the circles I grew up in, had a lot of books. That Blessed Hope, teaching and defending the doctrine of the rapture of the church. Book by various authors. commentaries on the Book of Revelation by similar authors. Um, John Walvoord, Roy B. Zuck, also big on premillennial dispensationalism. And there are many others, J. Vernon McGee, also Dallas Theological Seminary graduate. I learned about him first through the Bible program, where it goes through the Bible in 5 years on many radio stations around the world. He is also a dispensational premillennialist, along with some of these other Dallas Theological Seminary people like Walvoord and Zuck, as well as Ryrie. So I started to notice in my own studies that dispensationalism had sort of origins to it, and there were particular people who taught it. I kind of always grew up thinking, well, dispensational premillennialism, that's what the Bible teaches. There's no other system. All other systems, are liberal or modernistic. They deny the return of Christ physically to the earth. They deny the bodily resurrection, etc. Many books along that line will kind of teach those things. Have some other examples here of dispensational works, the law and rightly dividing the word. Rightly dividing the word is kind of a buzz phrase among the dispensational premillennialists. You got to rightly divide, and they introduce all kinds of various divisions into the Word of God that you can learn more about reading their works. So just go through some others. Douglas Stauffer, again, several of these books that we've shown, very thick books even, on the subject of prophecy. One book, Rightly Divided, as I mentioned. That's sort of a key phrase. Reviving the Blessed Hope. Commentary on First Thessalonians there, and maybe even Second Thessalonians. It's been a while since I've read that. I believe both of them are in there. But Reviving the Blessed Hope, you can see commentary on Matthew 24, When the End Begins, by the same author. So I never really considered that there was any other teaching, and I never really dove into where did dispensationalism originate and who are the main teachers of it today. I found out with this Dallas Theological Seminary stuff some more of the origins of dispensational premillennialism. And one of the old-time teachers, Louis Sperry Schaeffer, had Systematic Theology, 4-volume set there, 4th volume being some conclusion matters and an index. So actually it's 8 volumes total, I guess, or 7. Some of them are combos. But either way, 4-volume set as far as books in total. And he was one of the old-time dispensationalists. So I started to see that not all dispensationalists agree on everything. There's different branches of dispensationalists. And Charles Ryrie actually talks a little bit about this in his book, although he doesn't really classify himself too differently from most traditional dispensationalists. He would just say he's just a dispensationalist. And then he contrasts that with progressive dispensationalism. And then you have covenant theology in here, which is non-dispensational. You have ultra or hyper dispensationalist, which maybe Schaeffer would lean a little bit more towards, but he was one of the more original or founders of dispensationalism. I wouldn't consider him hyper or ultra necessarily. And then things to come, Dwight Pentecost, also sort of a standard dispensational premillennial work. This one's a little bit more scholarly than the others, but it was a good book. And the thing I like about Dwight Pentecost is he discusses some of the differences of dispensational premillennial teaching and introduces you to some of the earlier teachers of dispensational premillennial thought. Another Dallas Theological Seminary grad. This is, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. He's a Messianic Jew and teaches on Israelology, the missing link in systematic theology. And Dallas Theological Seminary grad again. He discusses the difference between covenant postmillennialism, covenant amillennialism, covenant premillennialism, and then dispensationalism. And I think this was his doctoral work here, so pretty lengthy. Big problem with this book is it's old now, and he only deals with a lot of the older arguments there, so not as useful for many modern readers today. So as I said, I didn't really ever consider that there was any other teaching besides dispensational premillennialism. And a good book that I read, Regnum Calorum, haven't finished the whole thing, but Charles Hill, Patterns of Millennial Thought in Early Christianity. Turns out not all Christians of all time have been premillennial, and certainly not dispensational. So this author kind of just discusses the theory that early on in the church, all Christians, all Orthodox Christians, that is, were premillennialist. And, they believed in Christ reigning on the earth for 1,000 years, that golden age, Israel's prominent in land again, etc., etc. So that's sort of regnum calorum. He really kind of debunks that theory and shows that there were many Orthodox Christians early on that even taught a amillennial or non-chiliastic view of eschatology. Chiliasm there meaning thousand or thousandism. Millennium is a Latin word, and chilia or chiliasm is a Greek derivative there. And then John MacArthur, also big dispensational premillennialist. Didn't want to leave him out, but a lot of his commentaries, his preaching, he does hold to what he calls a leaky dispensationalist. So I also want to include him. That's sort of the system he goes through. So in my journey of dispensationalism and just learning about eschatology, as I said, I never really knew that there was anything else. Started discovering the origins of eschatology, and particularly this system. And I learned that a man by the name of John Nelson Darby in the 19th century, a prominent leader in the Plymouth Brethren movement, got involved in some prophecy conferences. And there's debates about a vision of this one girl and this man named Irving. And I'm not going to get into all that. I believe John Nelson Darby was, a Christian. I believe that he believed the Bible, and I believe that he thought that his system was adhering to the Bible. I don't believe he developed dispensationalism from a little girl's vision that she had about a secret rapture of the church, but that is essentially where the doctrine originated, was with John Nelson Darby in the 19th century, and they were trying to convince people to leave their organized, churches and come out and just, take the Lord's Supper, meet in small groups, and wait for the rapture of the church. So that was John Nelson Darby. And that came over to America, where you didn't have all these state churches, and they weren't successful really at getting people to leave their church, but they were very successful getting people to accept their doctrines of dispensational premillennialism. You have people like D.L. Moody that got very into that system, and you have the C.I. Scofield and the old Scofield or the new Scofield Bible. And so there's been development within dispensationalism. Some of your old-time dispensationalists like John Nelson Darby or Louis Barry Schaeffer would teach something differently from maybe how Charles Ryrie or Dwight Pentecost would teach it regarding dispensationalism, and certainly different from maybe how John MacArthur would teach the premillennial system there. So there's a bunch of varieties of dispensationalism, and I was just learning all these things, and it was kind of concerning to me. No one before the 19th century believed in a secret rapture of the church. Certainly Christians have believed in a rapture of the church where God's people will be resurrected to be with Christ, but never in this, sort of secret rapture before a 7-year tribulation period prior to a millennial reign on the earth. That was, not held by anyone really before John Nelson Darby made that popular there in the 19th century. So I got to reading and studying from a man named Samuel Waldron, More of the End Times Made Simple. I actually watched his lecture series first that he has on monergism.com. I'd recommend that. And just started learning how you can be really a Orthodox Christian and accept other views other than the dispensational premillennial system. So in The End Times Made Simple just goes through a view of eschatology from an amillennial perspective, and he does that same in his class. More of the End Times Made Simple kind of deals with more of the hermeneutical issues that separate the systems. Another really good book that I read on this whole subject was A Case for Amillennialism by Kim Riddlebarger, and this one was a very good read. Forward there by Michael Horton. I would highly recommend this book as well, A Case for Amillennialism. And also, John MacArthur preached at the Shepherds Conference in 2007 why every self-respecting Calvinist is a premillennialist. And the system of premillennialism that he was teaching was dispensational. So really, MacArthur is, and the seminary that he runs over there in California, they do teach dispensationalism. And this was a friendly response from Sam Waldron on MacArthur's Millennial Manifesto. Goes right along with his The End Times Made Simple books. Very easy read. Took me about a day or two to get through that. So that was sort of the amillennial series of books there that I have. I'll show you some more here in a second, but I just want to give you an idea of the flavors of eschatology. One thing that really stuck with me from Sam Waldron's lectures and from his book is that there are basically 4 different Orthodox views of eschatology. And I think that eschatology does divide Christians, but unnecessarily. And just because someone has a different view of the millennium doesn't make them a non-Orthodox Christian. It doesn't make them someone who doesn't believe the Bible. And he goes over the differences and the history of millennial thought, basically throughout church history, and basically shows that this dispensational premillennialism that's so popular today is really a novel concept. It's a new idea. Premillennialism certainly is not new. There were many people who were premillennial early on in the church, obviously, but there was another system. And I'll show you some works such as Wayne Grudem. So Wayne Grudem and his systematic theology, pretty good book here. A little bit of charismatic Baptist perspective, sort of. But this systematic theology by Wayne Grudem, he holds what they call historic or covenant premillennialism, and quite distinct from the dispensational system in that they do not hold a true division between Israel and the church, but that the church is the new and true Israel, the fulfillment, the eschatological Israel, and that there will not be a secret rapture of the church, but that the church will go through tribulation in this time, and that Christ will come back to the earth and reign for 1,000 years in a millennial period, and that's basically the premillennial system. Christ returns, and then there's a 1,000-year millennium on earth before the eternal state. Other books and other viewpoints would be like postmillennial. I don't have too many books on postmillennialism. I do have a couple. Lorraine Bednar writes on postmillennialism. I have some of his works, but really don't have too much to discuss with premillennialism or postmillennialism, sorry. Some other books that I kind of read on amillennialism. This is sort of the standard text. Cornelius Venema, The Promise of the Future, sort of an older reference here, Anthony Hoekema, and The Bible in the Future. These are 2 of the foundational texts, really, a little bit older one, a little bit newer on amillennialism. Read those along with Kim Riddlebarger and then Samuel Waldron's works. And then G.K. Bill on his New Testament Biblical Theology also kind of goes through some of those eschatological themes, really the unfolding the Old Testament and the New, and really kind of demonstrates the how the cohesiveness of the amillennial system and how the Bible really sticks together. Another book I read, The Meaning of the Millennium. This is one of those 4 views books. George Eldon Ladd, which held to the historic or covenant premillennial position. Herman Hoyt, who was a dispensational premillennial, as I mentioned, Lorraine Bednar being a postmillennialist, and Anthony Hoekema being a amillennialist. And this was a good book. Hoekema definitely writes the best essay of the 4, but you can see they go back and forth a little bit on some of these issues. So this is also another book that I'd recommend reading on eschatology. Gerhardus Voss, in his biblical theology and also discussion of the Pauline eschatology, early, I think it's 1930s work here, but discusses basically eschatology from an amillennial standpoint. And then one by Sam Storms, Kingdom Come, the Amillennial Alternative. He's a little bit more preteristic than I am. So there's basically the views of preterism, historicism, futurism, and idealism. Preterism is divided really into hyper-preterism and preterism formally. So hyper-preterism or full preterist would basically believe that all of Matthew 24, all of the book of Revelation, and ultimately all prophecies in the New Testament have already been fulfilled prior to AD 70. And so they don't look for a literal return of Christ. Sam Storms does not hold to that view. He would be sort of along the lines of someone like R.C. Sproul, who is a preterist but not a hyper-preterist. And that really is a distinction in whether you can be Orthodox or not. If you don't believe in the second return of Christ, then you are not an Orthodox Christian. But Sam Storms does believe that. So he holds to many preteristic views, but not hyper-preterism. So he would fall along those same lines of R.C. Sproul. But this book was a little bit even more preteristic than I am. I think a good eschatology can include all elements of preterism, futurism, historicism, and idealism. I would describe myself primarily as a modified idealist, sort of along the amillennial redemptive historical lines there. And what else do I want to discuss here with all these different books? As I mentioned, this is just a rapid-fire discussion of books on eschatology. And when I became amillennial and left sort of the dispensational system, really wanted to read some good commentaries on Revelation. So G.K. Bill, this is just the shorter commentary that he has. Very good. This is kind of considered the standard work on Revelation. You can get his longer, more technical commentary. I think it's in the New International Greek Text commentary series. But I like the shorter one, a little bit easier to read. I could, work with one of those scholarly ones, but it takes a little bit more time to get through. But this one's certainly adequate for most people who would want to study the book of Revelation. 600-page commentary on a 22-chapter book. More Than Conquerors, William Hendrickson, also a very good book. Sort of follows those same lines as G.K. Bill. A little bit shorter, a little bit more of a popular and an easy read. And Dennis Johnson, A Triumph of the Lamb. I've removed all the dust jackets off most of my books. I just feel like they last longer that way, and I put the dust jackets away. But Triumph of the Lamb, Commentary on Revelation, Dennis Johnson, also very good. And I just kind of read these three together, working through those, More Than Conquerors, Revelation, G.K. Bill, and Triumph of the Lamb, Dennis Johnson. I really answered a lot of my questions regarding the book of Revelation, because I had only ever understood the book of Revelation as a futurist viewpoint. Dispensationalists are futurists. They believe that prophecy points to the future. Amillennialists kind of take a combined approach with that modified idealism, as I mentioned. And there's elements of preterism. There's elements of futurism. There's elements of historicism. So amillennialists would view the book of Revelation as discussing the history of the church, how the church has went through tribulation, and how ultimately the church will triumph in victory through our Savior, Jesus Christ, at the end. And the millennium there, that 1,000-year period, being figurative, so to speak, between the first coming and the second coming of Christ. And at that, when he comes, he will judge the wicked, he will raise the dead, and he will ultimately bring in the new heavens and the new earth. And that's our ultimate hope, not a interim period of a 1,000-year new earth, basically. Some other books that you might find interesting along those amillennial lines from a systematic theology standpoint. You have Robert Raymond, A New Systematic Theology of the Christian Faith, and his section on eschatology takes a good stand with amillennialism, as well as Michael Horton's The Christian Faith. Very good book, in my opinion. And the eschatological section is great. So that is a good book to read there. So I've got a lot of books here. One other kind of series you might be interested in before you dive full bore into eschatology, and one thing that I had to learn before I could accept the amillennial system, was getting more into covenant theology. So Samuel Renahan, this was one of his, I don't know if it was his doctoral dissertation or master's work. I think it might have been a master's work, but just going through the federal theology of the English Particular Baptist, Greg Nichols and his discussion on covenant theology, O. Palmer Robertson and the Christ of the Covenants. You also have Nehemiah Cox and John Owen on covenant theology. Nehemiah Cox, of course, was old-time 1689 London Baptist Confession, probably one of the editors of that. So his work on covenant theology. And then you have a Baptist Distinctive on covenant theology by Earl Blackburn. And then probably the best of all of these, but probably the shortest as well, 154 pages, the Distinctives of Baptist Covenant Theology. So Michael Horton also has some works on covenant theology, but he does take a Presbyterian view on covenant theology, where we can also have a covenant theology that is distinctively Baptist. And so some of these works will kind of enlighten you, because everything I was trained in was dispensationalism. Dispensationalism, that's all there is. If you believe the Bible, you're a dispensationalist. So when I read a lot of these works, it kind of helped me untrain my mind from those things and kind of see the Bible through a different perspective and really see some of the downfalls of dispensationalism. But that's just my story. Those are some of the books that I've read. I challenge you to just, read the Bible, read the scriptures, pray, and then just take advantage of these other men who have done the same and who've written these books, and just try to learn all that you can. And ultimately, you may come out on a different wavelength. You may come out from a different perspective. You may stay a devout premillennial dispensationalist. You may become a historic premillennialist. You may develop postmillennialism. You may become preteristic, but I challenge you to, study the Word of God, to read eschatological works, and to really consider the options that are out there. There are 4 orthodox views of eschatology: dispensational premillennialism, the most common today; historic premill, postmill, and amill. And ultimately now I am amillennialist, and I think there are many great works that I presented today that you can read on your own time, and hope that this video has been a blessing to you and a guide. So that'll be it for today. Thanks.